Now, if premises 1, 2, and 3 are true, then it seems like the first conclusion follows from them directly. Why? Well, because if there are these future civilizations with enormous computing capabilities, and they're inclined to produce ancestor simulations, and they're able to produce many of them, and the beings that are in these simulations are conscious, well, then it just follows that most of the minds in existence in that future world would be simulated minds rather than, real minds, for lack of a better term. And not that the simulated minds aren't real minds, but just that they aren't what's sometimes called like the base reality or the foundational reality minds. They're simulations from that foundational reality. And so that claim about how many or what the proportion of simulated to non-simulated minds is follows pretty directly from premise 1, premise 2, and premise 3. And it just says that there's a far greater proportion of simulated minds in comparison with non-simulated ones. Now, this last conclusion follows from the intermediate conclusion, only if we also assume that we don't have any indication, any independent indication as to whether our mind is in the simulated category or the real foundational mind category. In other words, we don't have any independent evidence that can convince us that it's one or the other. And here's how that works. When you have a certain distribution, you know that all things of a certain large type, let's say people, fall into one of two categories, category A or category B, and you know that 95% of people fall into category A, then for any given person, if you don't know or don't have any other indicators as to whether they fall into category A or category B, you should always guess that they are in category A, because they're more likely to be in category A. If 95% of people are in category A and only 5% are in B, then if you run into a person and you don't know whether they're in one or the other and you have no other way of telling, then if you have to make a guess, you should pick the one that the larger proportion of the group as a whole are in. And this is what Bostrom calls the bland indifference principle. So in the same way, since we don't have any independent evidence as to whether we're in a simulation or in a base reality, in some more fundamental reality, then if we're already convinced, as conclusion 1 articulates, that the vast majority of minds like ours are simulated, then we should draw the inference that it's more probable that our mind is simulated than that it's not. Not a guarantee that our mind is simulated, but that there's just a greater likelihood that our mind is simulated, and in perhaps a very much greater likelihood that our mind is simulated than that it's not. Now, I just want to remind you at this point that Bostrom's overall conclusion is not actually that we are living in a simulation. It's that one of three things must be true. Either we are living in a simulation, or future civilizations won't be sufficiently advanced to run many ancestor simulations, that is, we'll never reach a post-human stage, or that our post-human successors will come to an agreement not to run ancestor simulations for ethical reasons. And so, or perhaps because there are different kinds of beings and they just decide not to. So one of these three things at the bottom of the screen must be true. That is Bostrom's overall conclusion from his process of reasoning in the article. And at this point, I'll pose a few questions. I mean, first and most basically, are you convinced by this? And if not, where do you disagree? Do you think Bostrom's made a mistake somewhere? And if so, where? And then second, whether or not you agree with Bostrom, it's interesting to ask which of these three scenarios that Bostrom says at least one of which must be true. Which of these three scenarios do you think is most probable? In general, how much probability do you assign to these three? And your answer to this question may change depending on whether you agree with the rest of his argument or not. But it is worth considering, particularly if you do agree with his argument overall. Then it's a very interesting follow-up question to ask. Well, how likely do you think that overall argument makes it that we're living in a simulation, as opposed to makes it that future civilizations won't be advanced enough? Like, do you find yourself thinking that this ultimately ends up being more of an argument against posthumanism, or that that is against the prediction of posthumanism, or do you think this ultimately ends up being an argument in favor of our own simulatedness?